In the previous video, we spent some time talking about the way of life of Native Americans on the Great Plains, and we spent some time talking about their sort of social and their cultural developments and some of the things that they relied upon, things like the importance of bison and the centrality of bison in their day-to-day lives. Now we're going to bring back into the fold the growing threat of this idea of manifest destiny, this idea of European settler colonialism. And we're going to talk about the role of the permanent Indian frontier and talk about the policy of the US government in this early period to essentially start to push Native Americans out and away from various different parts of the land in which they lived. So, in terms of its origins, and in terms of what it is, let's say, the permanent Indian frontier was a policy that was introduced by the US government in the early 19th century, and it sought to designate a permanent boundary for Native American tribes that would be separated from the expanding settlements of the European Americans. So it's part of really a broader framework of American westward expansion and settler colonialism, intended theoretically to protect Native American land and cultures from settler encroachment. It ultimately fails. The permanent Indian frontier is, of course, a failure. So really, the idea of a permanent Indian frontier or a permanent boundary for Native Americans, this idea emerges in response to increasing conflicts that existed between the indigenous tribes and the European settlers. Of course, there were conflicts. They were coming in and they were expanding westward and they were taking people's land. Of course, there was going to be violence. As settlers moved westward, there were mounting concerns about the disruption of the Native American societies and the violence that resulted from territorial disputes. And so the increase in government pressure led to the formalizing of a relationship with the Native Americans to attempt to create a boundary that existed between the settler society and the indigenous territories. We can see that the Indian Removal Act, for example, of 1830, which we'll spend some time talking about in a second in more detail, authorized the relocation of tribes from the eastern US to lands west of the Mississippi River, and fundamentally was a key event which contributed to the creation of the permanent Indian frontier. Let's think about this legislation in a bit more detail then. So the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was signed into law by Andrew Jackson and led to the forced migration of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the southern United States to what was considered to be Indian territory, quote unquote. This was Indian territory in the West, Indian territory in modern-day Oklahoma. The law was based on the belief that relocating Indian tribes or Native American tribes to the West would preserve their way of life, but also provide room for the growing settler population. It almost, by extension then, the sort of logic of the Indian Removal Act places the desires of settler colonialism on the same kind of equal footing as the desires of Native Americans to just live their lives peacefully, which as you can probably see from the way I'm framing it, I don't necessarily agree with. And so in theory, the US government would establish the Mississippi River and the lands beyond it as the permanent frontier where Native Americans could live without interference from the settler colonialists. Now, in theory, if that happened, would that be okay? Well, of course, I'm not going to think about too much the sort of morality of this. We're doing history, but again, it would be a lot. It would be theoretically a lot better than what ultimately happens with the permanent Indian frontier being a failure. But the goal was to confine indigenous tribes to a space where they could continue traditional lifestyle, but also basically give European settlers free rein to be able to settle in the frontier. It also had the role, though, of keeping the settlers and native populations apart, because, of course, where there is a connection between the two, there is, of course, going to be violence. In 1851, then, a few decades later, we see a formalizing of the concept of the permanent Indian frontier with the Treaty of Fort Laramie in 1851. Now, this, again, like I said, formalizes the concept of a permanent frontier. It was a treaty which was signed by representatives of the US government, as well as a number of Native American tribes. A number of Native American tribes, including the Crow tribes, the Arapaho tribes, the Sioux tribes, as well as a number of others. The primary objective of this treaty was to create a peaceful environment for the construction of roads, forts, telegraph lines across Native American lands, while assuring that the tribes and their territories would remain protected from settler encroachment. Now, under the treaty, then we start to see the US government establish specific boundaries for each tribe, which was seen as an attempt to create a permanent division between settler and native territories. This treaty, alongside the Indian Removal Act, was part of the government's broader strategy to protect both settler interests but also native communities by segregating them into separate zones, increasingly these zones becoming smaller and smaller and becoming increasingly encroached, which, when we get to the next slide, is obviously a very important feature of the failure of the Indian permanent frontier. In terms of its implementation, then, it was initially presented, the idea of a permanent Indian frontier was initially presented as a means for protecting Native American rights and autonomy. But then the policy begins to face numerous challenges when it comes to its implementation. We start to see, for example, one of the primary reasons for the failure of this permanent Indian frontier is the fact that we see the relentless westward expansion of European American settlers, especially following the 1862 Homestead Act. The Homestead Act of 1862 offered 160 acres of land to European settlers if they could successfully cultivate it for 5 years. This act, combined with the allure of gold discoveries, so the California gold rush in 1849, for example, that we've spoken about, leads to the influx of settlers into areas that had been originally and traditionally designated as native lands under previous treaties. And so, as settlers flooded to the west, the government began to view the idea of a permanent boundary as untenable. Also, with the sort of economic benefits of going to the further west with the California gold rush, obviously they were incentivized, the US government were incentivized to view the permanent boundary as untenable because they would benefit directly from having settler expansion and colonialism in those further westward areas. Settlers were demanding land for agriculture, railroad companies were demanding them as well, all were critical to the idea of westward expansion. They needed land to build transcontinental railroads. The settlers and industries needed to push through the lands that had been designated for Native Americans. Again, getting all the way to California would mean going all the way through things like the Oregon Trail. And so ultimately we start to see that throughout the 19th century, numerous treaties made with Native American tribes would begin to be violated by the US government. These broken promises included the removal of tribes from their designated land and the allotment of those lands to European settlers. After the Treaty of Fort Laramie, for example, in 1851, settlers continued to encroach upon Native American lands with the creation of the Oregon Trail. This was the expansion of railroads and the influx of settlers into the Great Plains, which fundamentally violated this treaty. Many tribes found themselves facing increasing pressure and conflict. The promise of an Indian permanent frontier then begins to erode as more settlers begin to move into these areas. The response to these violations was resistance, the attempts at resistance, leading to military confrontations, like the Red Cloud's War, for example, where we see the Lakota tribes successfully fighting against the US forces, attempting to build forts along the Bozeman Trail through their lands. But these were examples of the eroding of the permanent Indian frontier. What we see later on then, in the late 1800s, is the fundamental collapse of the permanent Indian frontier. It ultimately collapses for several reasons, one of which includes growing settler populations. Secondly is the construction of transcontinental railroads. And then thirdly is the federal government's increasing desire for the native land. Fundamentally, the idea of a permanent Indian frontier fails because everybody who weren't Native Americans, people who were settler colonizers, they just wanted the land that was not designated to them. And so the Indian frontier would eventually start to erode. But the final nails in the coffin of the Indian frontier was, of course, the 1887 Dawes Act, known colloquially as the General Allotment Act. This act sought to divide tribal lands into individual plots. Ostensibly, the reason was to encourage Native Americans to adopt agriculture and to integrate into American society. Again, sort of a erasure of their cultural identity. The Dawes Act undermined tribal land ownership and communal living and pushed Native Americans towards assimilation, opening up huge portions of land for non-native settlers. So that might have been the ostensible reason for why the Dawes Act was passed, but the in practice reality was that it resulted in the loss of millions of acres of native land. For example, the Cherokee Nation lost approximately 90 million acres of land, which was sold to non-native settlers.